Hello, everyone. My name is Sil the DM, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to be going over the most recent session of my Ixalan campaign. We're going to do a quick recap of the series up until this point, since you're kind of coming in after we've had a few sessions to put our feet under us. So Ixalan, for those who don't know and click this video, curious for some D&D campaign just experience, is one of the planes from Magic the Gathering. It is a area that is full of pioneers and many different factions, all warring for control of resources, treasure, powerful artifacts. It has this very South American feel to it. The conquistadors coming from a faraway land, the vast native empire, and ritualistic forest shamans. It has this beautiful mix of all of this, plus pirates, which is actually the most relevant part of the faction, since our players are all members of the pirate faction on Ixalan, the Brazen Coalition. Ixalan is divided into four factions. The River Heralds, a group of tribal merfolk who live in the deep woods of Ixalan, hiding many secrets, and who control the waterways. The Brazen Coalition, pirates, lawless brigands, collections of many fleets led by powerful admirals, which was formed when their home continent was conquered by a powerful and rather merciless force known as the Legion of Dusk, which is, in this setting, the Spanish conquistadors, who are vampires, who have conquered the complete other continent of the world and are now pushing into Ixalan, chasing their prey, and searching for their founder, Alenda, the Dusk Rose. The fourth faction is the Empire of the Sun, a powerful force that rules over much of the land of Ixalan, though it used to own a lot more back in its prime. The Empire is known for being hungry and territorial, and beyond this, their immense military might, as they have a powerful military that is fueled and carried on the back of dinosaurs. So the setting has a lot of fun going on for it. To give you a quick discussion of what's been going on in the campaign and our characters, I'm just going to go over it real fast right now. So the campaign has 5 characters. There are 4 PCs, and then I also, the DM, am currently running like an NPC PC who's honestly just an NPC who's like slightly more involved in the story and does have class levels and levels up with the other players. So we'll go over all of them. We'll go over mine first because it's mine. It's the easiest to go over in detail very quickly. I play Shura, a merfolk rogue who has been on board this ship, that the crew is sort of built around, the Vaga de Oro, for some time now as a ship hand. He's a merfolk working with the Brazen Coalition, which has a lot of racial and tension and distrust around it, and just a lot of racism, and he takes it all very much in stride. He has proven himself a stalwart fighter and a potential leader over the course of the start of the campaign through his actions, and has been promoted very recently to the head navigator aboard the Vaga de Oro. Next, we have Pelennor, the Siren Ranger, and her animal companion, Sea Swift, the Pterosaur. Pelennor is a very flighty, sort of rambunctious character, who was hired on the ship to replace the previous watchman who was murdered by a flock of pterosaurs, and very recently acquired a pterosaur pet animal companion of her own. She has a bit of a wild streak with her and is a little odd at times, but aren't we all? Speaking of odd at times, we have Famine, the Goblin Sorcerer. Famine works in the gunnery aboard the Vaga de Oro and is a little ball of spitfire who has a lot of issues with fire but still uses fire primarily as their offense. They are a dragon blood sorcerer using a unique homebrew variant that gives them a colorless dragon due to the nature of their background and a connection to a once long ago visitor to the plane known as Ugin, the spirit dragon. For people who are in on Magic the Gathering lore, you might know that that's an interesting thing. The other two players are piloting adoptive brothers. There is Osaha, the merfolk bard, whose mother, Odana, runs a tavern in the Brazen Coalition city of High and Dry. Osaha is a dancer who is often very much the party's majority healer, at least in most recent fights. Osaha as an adoptive brother, piloted by our other player named Alani, a half-orc cleric, who, due to some unfortunate scheduling, hasn't really had the chance to get involved in much scraps as of yet. And that's where we're at for the players. To give a quick catch-up of the series as a whole up until this session, we started the campaign with all the players getting jobs aboard the Vaga de Oro and figuring out where they would belong on this ship. Pelennor quickly became the scout. Famine was completely comfortable working with the other goblins and the cannoneers, being one of the gunners, where she quickly asserted herself as an alpha among the pack by gambling the other goblins out of basically all their worldly possessions. Osaha ended up just sort of filling the role of a general ship's person, occasionally helping one of the members of the crew with inventory and picking things up and putting things down, and a lot of cleaning. Alani started off very much the same way. However, they gradually have rotated into becoming one of the ship's helper after a growing rapport with the ship's cook, a orc named Zag Helmsplitter, who is a one-legged man who doesn't really get seen out of the kitchen very much. He's also missing his right arm. Yeah. A lot of the members of the Vaga de Oro have some damage to them, so I want to make sure I have that right in my notes. So, after sailing for a little while, the group went to a small island where the captain of their ship, Captain Midas, believed that, at the insistence of his current navigator, a human man named Cass, there would be some booty, some fine loot. And if that doesn't get your blood alive, I don't know what does. So he decided that this would be a perfect test for the newbies to the crew, and sent them out with a few of his regulars to the island while the ship stayed offshore, covering the back end. They went into the island and found the temple, a small old shrine that they were hoping that would contain some loot. And they were attacked by a flock of regisaurs, raptors, basically. They were handled, though some of the members of the crew got rather severely hurt. Famine suffering a double critical hit from one of the raptors' multi-attacks, which was real bad. Almost just killed the absolute crap out of her. But they survived. However, during the fight, one of their NPCs, the apprentice to the navigator Cass, got spooked and ran into the temple, triggering a trap, and ended up dead. They found a bit of loot and did a little exploring and returned to the dinghy to get back to the ship, the land boat, where they discovered the ship was under attack by merfolk, by river heralds, and a small group of them attacked them on the beach as well, ending up dropping Osaha due to just the lack of healing that the party had available to them, and getting several other people, including Shura, severely hurt. Um, After defeating them, however, and healing Osaha with some medicine that the merfolk soldiers carried on them, uh, the two parties were reconnected. Their treasure was delivered, and there was a little bit of sadness over the loss of the apprentice, and there was just a lot of distrust going on in the air. Later that night, as the ship was celebrating their survival and the low amount of casualties they suffered, Osaha heard some people arguing, and then a lot of scrambling and the sound of weapons being drawn, and burst into a room to discover what appeared to be Shura being attacked by Cass, the navigator, and a merfolk who was in the room with him. Pushing Cass onto the merfolk, Shura pinned them both against the wall, and using the opportunity to murder the merfolk assassin. And in the effort to push Cass onto this merfolk, he ended up impaling Cass on that merfolk's weapon. A little bit of research into the room and an investigation led by the captain, Osaha, and Famine discovered implications that Cass was a double agent for the Heralds, and that he had specifically lured them to this island so the heroes could ambush them. And that he had sent his apprentice to the island in hopes that this would keep him safe from the ambush. Regrettably, that was not the case. After Shuro was cleared of any incidents with the murder, he was promoted to navigator stand-in for now, and the ship returned to high and dry to deal with some issues, pick up some new personnel, and just restock. The merfolks they had killed having several maps of the area where ancient temples were marked on them, during which Shura spent some time researching the maps they'd acquired from the fallen merfolk and plotting the next course for the ship. The crew spent a single night in high and dry, where Alani found a bar that was in some way connected to her goddess, a moon goddess, which is a very rare type of worship in Ixalan, which is a very sun worship oriented land. And also witnessed Shura having a private conversation with a woman that Alani did not recognize, who referred to him by a different name. After this, everyone returned to the ship, and they set sail. Osaha, who had been growing a bit close with Shura, spent most of the trip in his room, performing while he worked on just navigating. And the two of them were getting a little close and drawing the attention of some members of the crew, including Alani, who did, after asking for some time alone, interrogated Shura about the woman he was meeting with, and he explained to Alani in private that it was the Admiral Del Orgo, the woman responsible for this fleet that they were members of now, the woman in control of the captain of their ship, who believed that Captain Midas was pilfering gold and cutting into her share of the loot, and that she had put Shura in a position to get on the ship to catch Midas in the act, or declare his name, one or the other. And he warned Alani that he would need to not expose that they know anything about this, or it would put them and their brother in danger. After this sort of tense moment and a little bit more conversation and shenanigans with Pelennor learning to tame their new companion, Sea Swift, the ship arrived at a trio of islands. The easternmost island bears a River Herald fort, basically, a heavily fortified position that the ship did not want to deal with. However, the area between the islands are often blocked with these large rocky outcroppings that the ship simply can't maneuver. Uh, so they decided that they would release several small rowboats into the river systems on the islands, which would allow them to go through the center island between the other two, come out a river on the other side, completely avoiding the River Herald Fortress, and then cross the strait to the third island, which bears the temple. Since the third island, its shore along the access route that the ship has access to is just sheer 100-foot high cliffs. Not something that they could easily scale. And that's about where our story takes up. The previous session, before the session we're discussing today, ended after a brief scuffle with our intrepid pirates fighting off a group of River Herald scouts who were apparently just doing a patrol on the middle island between these three radial islands. They had managed to deal with them without too many serious wounds. Ernesto, the cooper and shipwright apprentice who was with them, ended up getting fairly hurt during the fight, a few gashes. Shura and Bardov, one of the other crew members with them, an orc shipmate who's really just muscle aboard the ship. He picks things up, he puts things down. Had both been rather hurt, but Ernesto was definitely the one who got hurt the most in the fight. And one of their rowboats, which one of the River Heralds had punctured several deep holes into below water level. And it was beginning to sink rather rapidly. And that is where we take up our session for October 21st, 2019. Shura, seeing the situation, what's going on, as Osaha and Famine and Alani bail out of their own ships to try and keep the other ship up from sinking to the bottom of the river, quickly began ushering orders to the people who were there technically under his charge, as the captain put him in charge of this expedition, as a show of faith, possibly. And he quickly barked orders. Ernesto, Orson, get the ships to shore, get that one drained, look into how long that's going to take to be repaired. And everyone else set up a perimeter as quickly as possible. Make sure that there's nothing coming from the woods beyond. And everyone did it. They pulled the rowboats to shore. Ernesto, the cooper, pulled out his tools, while Bardov used his heavy battle axe to chop down some tree to get them lumber. While this was happening, the other players all set up a general watch, sort of fanning out in different areas to view into the jungle around them to see if anything was approaching. And Shura methodically ran through all of the merfolk that they had defeated, and then began tying their bodies to rocks and dropping them into the river, so that they wouldn't be carried by the current, but instead would float just about a foot beneath the water. Very quietly, and with no one really interacting with him. While this was happening, Pellinor, who had been itching to fly, but at the repeated suggestion of everyone in the party that they do not do this while within the woods, where the River Heralds could use nature magic to rip them from the sky, just decided to hop up to the first branch, just to do a little hippie hop, where they landed next to a sleeping jaguar, who was no longer sleeping. Given a single action to react to this large hunting cat looking at this bird that just landed next to it, like, what the fuck are you doing? Pellinor quickly cast Speak with Animals and informed it that it was sorry and was going to leave now. Please don't try to eat me. And then jumped down from the branch, informing the others that there is a jaguar up there and that they should keep an eye on it. Which interested Alani, as the patron animal of Alani's goddess is the jaguar. So Alani busied himself by moving over to that branch and watching the jaguar from beneath. The whole repairs for the rowboat took about an hour, between getting the wood and getting everything separated and ready to go. During this time, while Shura was throwing bodies back into the water, which distracted Alani from the Jaguar, Alani noticed that the orc, Bardov, had taken off his half plate and his shirt and was using the half plate to dump the rest of the water out of the rowboat that had begun to sink. And it was revealed that on his back was a large brand of this multi-layered dusk rose burned into his back. And this thick 6'2" orc with scars all along his arms and legs, with very, very dark purple hair pulled back in about 4 or 5 cornrows, had this huge brand taking up the majority of his back while he worked. And this caused Alani a bit of pain and to have some pretty powerful memories, as Alani, in their youth, several years ago, was a slave to the Legion of Dusk, the vampire faction, and that is their brand that they brand their slaves with. Alani bearing a similar brand over their breast, distracting themselves with the Jaguar, and Osaha, who noticed as well and is aware of his brother's history. The pair put it out of their mind for now, and then everyone got back into their ships. They sailed down the river for about another 2.5 hours or so before the sounds of heavy, labored breathing came on from above. During the sailing, by the way, there was a lot of shenanigans going on. Osaha decided that they would alleviate tension. So they just started to use prestidigitation constantly, changing people's clothing, making clothes warm, making clothes cold, which resulted in a lot of joking and humor surrounding erect nipples. Especially since Frederico, apparently, one of the NPCs with them, refers to his nipples as the girls, and very excitedly covers them when suddenly having his shirt chilled in the desert makes them quite visible, to which everyone was having a lot of fun. While this was all going on, however, they noticed this heavy, labored breathing and the sound of something splashing against the water. And as they pulled up closer, sort of moving through the deep, dense forest, keeping the rowboats as quiet as possible, they discovered a spineback, a huge, a large-sized dinosaur, probably about the size of 2 well-fed cattle, sort of mushed together, with sort of dark gray, bluish skin, and these alternating stripes of bright blue and yellow along its back, where spines run all the way down its body. On its side, its head limply pressed against the water like it was trying to drink, its breath being extremely labored, and they noticed that the side that was exposed to the air had a huge gash out of it, like a chunk of meat was pulled out of it, and that the flesh around the wound was beginning to turn black and riddled with necrosis, and basically rotting while still attached to the living dinosaur. At first, Shura considered putting the creature out of its misery and moving on, but not knowing how close whatever made that wound was, he suggested to the ships that they put their rows back in the water instead of being carried silently by the current and speed up. At which point there was a low, deep thud that sent ripples through the river. And then another. And everyone sort of looked at each other for a moment, just a little terrified. And then the spineback started to get up with how terrified it was. Its legs not able to bear itself through the wounds that it received, but it was forcing through the pain to get up anyways as best as it could, when suddenly a colossal dreadmaw ripped its way out of the woods. For someone who doesn't know, think of a T-Rex dialed to fucking infinity. This dinosaur was probably 5 times the size of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Similar design, except very feathery, as dinosaurs in Ixalan have a lot more of a feathery aesthetic to it than something you might imagine from, like, Jurassic Park. This Dreadmaw, who was easily big enough to eat 2 of their ships in a single bite, burst out of the woods and finished off its prey, while everyone else was rowing hard. Bardov, having taken over the third of the 3 rowboats, was moving super fast to get them away from that mess. And the others were struggling 2 rowing at a time to keep up with him. Eventually, they did get away, however, and Bardov was asked by Shura to switch out of rowing because he was going a little too hard, which embarrassed the orc, but he conceded that he probably was, in his panic, leaving them behind. Shura explained to him that if something happened to his boat while he was so far ahead, there was nothing they could do, and if something happened to their boats, they would have been left alone without him and his support. As they have 3 boats currently. Boat 1, upon which is Famine, Osaha, Federico, and Alesta. 2 humans from the crew, 1 male, 1 female. Boat 2 is Alani, Palinor, Mikhail, another human, and Bordov, the orc. And boat 3 is Shura, Ernesto, and Orson, who is the apprentice scribe aboard the ship. The other 4 members, as far as anyone on the crew knows, and as any of the players know, are just general ship hands, without extremely significant jobs on the ship that are specific to them. Unlike the first ship, or the third ship, with Shura, who is the navigator, Ernesto, who is the cooper's apprentice, and Orson, who is the scribe's apprentice. During all of this, whenever there is moments, everyone noticed Orson pulling out a small book and sort of scribbling in it with a charcoal pen. Especially now, after seeing the Colossal Dreadmaw, when there was a moment of peace again and everyone was able to catch their breath, there was a bit more relaxation to be had. Hours passed through the deep, hot jungle, and the silence of the explosive wildlife was broken by the sounds of cannon fire. And as the ship continued on, several members of the crew were able to spot through the dense woods just little glimpses of some ship off in the distance, massive, probably almost twice the size of the Vaga de Oro, blasting its cannons off to something in the distance. And aboard the ship, one member of the party noticed a large minotaur, through the sounds of the cannon fire, whipping around a red chain that looked like it was composed of fire. It was so hot. Wanting nothing to do with this, and with sunset fast approaching, Shura demanded that the ships dock themselves on the opposite side of the river. They quickly decided to set up watches, and while they were discussing, Shura, Ernesto, and Orson were all having a conversation about whether or not to forward the ships to the other strait or continue down the river, because at this point the island's not that wide. Pellinor, ever curious and itching to get a better glimpse of the fight, had wandered back towards their rowboats, which are now pulled up on the shore, considering to fly out to get a look at the battle and see what was going on. When someone called out to her from nearby the ships, she turned and saw Mikhail. Mikhail is, let me go through my notes here, about 5'6", 5'6", very short blonde hair that looks dyed, not natural, with very dark tan skin. He wears basic pirate leathers, loose-fitting white top, leather bracers, and he called out to Pellinor, saying, "I wouldn't do that if I were you. I would kindly suggest you not do something so foolish. You might end up getting yourself killed." And Pellinor, who had noticed earlier in the day that Mikhail was staring at her, she thought, used this moment of solidarity between the two of them, this moment of privacy, to confront him and switch the subject off of what she was about to be doing to what he had done, sort of displacing the conversation. Masterfully, I might add. And she confronted him, like, why were you staring at me? And slowly he admitted that he hadn't been looking at her, but had instead been looking at Sea Swift. And Pelennor, intrigued by this, and Sea Swift, their pterosaur child, basically nearby, offered to let Mikhail pet Sea Swift, though she joked that he won't eat you, but he'll probably take a bite. Where Mikhail laughed and revealed his left hand, which was missing his ring finger, and said, I've been there. And as he approached Sea Swift, he began speaking in a language that Pelennor didn't understand. And Pelennor noticed her animal companion go very relaxed. In fact, so relaxed that when Mikhail got about 5 feet away, he just held out his hand, and Sea Swift ran to it. Instead of waiting for him to approach, he paused and waited for the animal to approach him instead, which made Pelennor a little reflexively jealous, but also very intrigued. She pushed to know more about how he could do this, and he explained that up until about 6 years ago, he had been a member in the Sama Empire's cavalry, that he was a soldier, born and bred, basically, and flew on the back of pterosaurs in the Empire's army, which intrigued and annoyed Pelennor, who did not believe that the dinosaurs, as beautiful as they are, should be used as weapons of war. Having rescued Sea Swift from High and Dry, where some pirates had captured her from most likely an Empire breeding zone, where they would tend to the eggs, hatch them, and train their dinosaurs. And they were selling it for food, and Pelennor refused to allow that to happen. Which she explained to Mikhail, and he seemed very happy that she had saved the pterosaur. And there was a sad look on his face as he explained that he and his partner, his pterosaur, had decided to break away from the army to abandon their post and their position about 6 years ago. But before they could get out of the reach of Ixalan proper to the open air of the ocean, a group of river heralds ripped them out of the air using nature magic, which is what Pelennor had been warned against flying for repeatedly over the course of the journey, and warned that they need to keep Sea Swift close as well. For if the river heralds see them flying nearby within range, they'd pull them out of the sky with their magic. And this made Pelennor reconsider their life choices a little bit. But the real decision was Pelennor asked Mikhail to teach her how to speak that language, or the trick to calming Sea Swift down. And Mikhail offered to teach it to her in exchange for her not being so reckless, which she tentatively agreed to. And he, as this was going on, they finished their conversation and returned back to the others, who were busy having a bit of a conversation. Again, Shura was off on his own. Most of the members of the ships who were there were eating, as Pelennor and Mikhail returned. Alani slowly had approached Bardov, and was having a conversation with him, and quickly learning that, while good-meaning, he might have been a little slow, or at least not quick with certain things. Alani approached him, asking him about the scar on his back, and after a few different emotions passed over his face, settling eventually on something like, anger and distrust, he, "What do you want to know?" asked very gruffly, suddenly on edge, thinking that perhaps this is going to be someone who's going to make an issue over it. Um, Being an ex-slave gets all sorts of looks. Alani, realizing that they had perhaps not really explained their intentions appropriately, panicked and undid a bit of their shirt and pulled out uh, the bandage that they wear across their chest and pulled it off, revealing their own brand, which they had received a long time ago. And this softened Bardov up very quickly, and his face went from anger to confusion and then sadness, and he looked down and apologized for being so gruff and assuming the worst. Uh, and they had a very brief discussion in which Alani learned that uh, a very long time ago Bardov was a slave aboard a ship for quite some time, apparently. Um, it was all a little heavy at this point, and Alani was starting to get a lot of uncomfortable memories. And he decided the best way to handle this would be to just cover up his panic and embarrassment by acting like the conversation had never happened. So he started redoing his shirt and like, it never happened, don't worry about it, forget I asked. And this like, I never showed you anything, I never opened my shirt, it was nothing. And this confused Bardov, who thought perhaps Alani was just uncomfortable showing his body. So he was like, don't worry, you nice tits. To which Shura, who had been eavesdropping this whole time across the campsite, much to Osaha's chagrin, who had been actively jabbing him, and at one point bit on one of his frills that sort of are on his face to try and get him to stop listening to their brother's private conversation, just began cackling like a madman, unable to hold in his mirth at Bardov's reaction, which elicited more of Alani's embarrassment. During the night, Thamin took first watch with Federico and Alista, and it was relatively quiet. They eventually switched places with Mikhail, Pellinor, and Sea-Swift, where Pellinor asked Mikhail a little bit more about his history with the Sun Empire. Having never been to Ixalan proper, Pellinor was from the other continent, where most of the Brazen Coalition was from, and had only ever seen small islands on the outside of the continent. They'd never really been to the continent proper. And Mikhail explained how he wasn't really from a wealthy place. He was rather poor, but he was strong and did good work. And when he was 10, he was invited to enter into training to be a soldier. They performed a ritual to figure out which particular dinosaur he should be connected with, at which point we devolved into a massive conversation about Dinotopia, as I likened the ritual that went through on Ixalan as being something similar to that movie, where you are sort of like put through like basically a Facebook quiz and it determines your animal companion. But in this case, it determines what living war machine you're going to be trained with. And that he received his partner then, and they were raised together as soldiers. And he spent 8 years training and existing as a soldier in their army alongside his own pterosaur, as, again, a mounted cavalry, as someone who flew through the air. And how, though the Empire does a lot of good for its people, it's greedy, and there is a lot of infighting. And he explained that the general, the soldier in control of his unit of pterosaurs, was aiming for a promotion and wanted to earn the coveted title of war poet, and thought that the best way to do this would be to use his men to weaken a rival's squadrons. And so he had ordered his pterosaurs to basically do a flyby attack on one of the scouting parties of the other military force and kill them, uh, basically hindering his rivals' chances at being able to succeed enough to earn the promotion first. And this was the final line from Mikhail, who would not turn his mount against their brothers and companions, because to him, the military was basically his only family. At which point, the general in question threatened to kill his pterosaur if he didn't follow his orders. So he agreed to do it, but as the mission was started and him and his squad took off, he abandoned them. He completely bailed. He found an opportunity and got out of there. But before he and his pterosaur could get away, and Pelennor noticed that Mikhail never spoke the name of his companion, and any time he was about to do it, he stumbled on it, and then called it his partner or his companion. And it was just this moment where his throat would catch every time. And then it was ripped from the sky by the river heralds. However, after saying this, he paused and looked back at the group, at the two merfolk, the two real strangers in this group, and admitted that he was glad to have learned that not all merfolk were so bad, and that there were some decent people among them. After this conversation, which went on for almost their entire shift, ended, they went and woke up Shura, who woke up Alani, and who woke up Osaha for the last shift. They spent a little bit of time laughing and joking around, just lighthearted teasing between brothers, and Shura just being there, being an instigator as often as he can, because he just loves making shit with people. He's a genuine shit disturber, and he just loves watching it happen. But their shift went by with no major issues. And morning came. They woke up the rest of the crew. They relaunched the boats after a brief meal. They sailed for another hour or so, hearing the river getting closer, dumping out into the strait. They noticed the rapids and the currents suddenly picking up as jagged rocks began cropping out of the water as they got closer to the delta where it would pool out into the strait. And the river became dotted with small but very violent and turbulent whirlpools. And though Osaha magnificently managed to pilot fast the first bunch of them, piloting their little rowboat excellently with no issues, over the course of the two separate skill challenges they had to pass, each ship ended up losing at least one oar with how rough the waters got, and a fair bit of damage was done to Shora's ship. And Bardov, who, fearing their ship about to impale itself on one of the rocks, had grabbed onto the rock, the very sharp, jagged rock with both hands and pushed them off, tearing open his hands and getting blood all over himself. But they had managed to push past the whirlpools, pass the whirlpools, and into the open water. At which point, they got about halfway through the strait when it was time to roll on my random chart again, which is always fun for me. I love making random charts. I know some DMs don't agree with it, and maybe I'll do a conversation about that at some point, but I just love random charts, yo. I'm here for it. Especially when I make them myself. And that was when they noticed at the mouth of the strait, far to the north, the way that their ship wasn't able to come because it would have taken them too close to the River Herald's fortress. They saw a fleet of small ships and a dreadnought, a Dusk Legion dreadnought, a ship so large that it made the Vaga d'Oro look like a rowboat. Its huge form, this gold-looking ship with its spiky sort of aesthetic, these long, sharp sections coming out, its massive volume of sails that seem to trail an unnatural dust or shadow with it. And as this happened, Alani, who had been rowing for their ship, started to have a full-blown like PTSD episode. Alani's breath was catching. He was having a hard time breathing. It felt like he was drowning. He remembered his time on the ship, the burning fire of the brand, and he felt his body going cold from when the ship sank, and his hands and feet, which were tightly manacled, holding him down as he went under the water, and his ears filled with that sound of rushing water, and he felt like his lungs were going to burst. Noticing that he had stopped rowing and equally panicked, Bardov pulled Alani out of the way and tossed him into Pelennor and Mikhail, who held him, noticing how shook he was, and once again Bardov took over and began rowing at full speed, the other two rowboats doubling up their oars to try and keep up with him, as they desperately tried to get out of sight of the dreadnought before they would get noticed. And as this happened, while they were rowing, Alani again felt himself drowning, felt the cold all over his body except for his chest where it was burning hot. And in front of him, though he was looking away, he could see the sweat pouring down Bardov's face and tears coming from his eyes. And through his half-plate, it almost looked like Alani could see the burning red lines of the brand beginning to form, taking up the entirety of the orc's back, till the point it was almost glowing, bright hot in his face. And then they were in the shadow and shade of the other island. And Alani snapped out of it slowly, and the pair of them, breathing heavily, sort of pushed themselves away from that moment. Bardov, who'd pushed his body far too hard, far too quickly, collapsed against the front of the boat. His head sort of leaned over the side. His arms, now ripped and blistered brutally from how hard he had been rowing, on top of the wounds he had received from the rocks. His body looking just sweat-covered and pale and exhausted. Alani, shaken by all of this, but seeing how hurt Bardov was, began channeling a bit of healing magic into his hand, and stumbled over the ship as Mikhail had taken up the oars again, and ended up falling against Bardov, and healing him, which healed a crack in his tusk as well. And Alani sort of rested on top of the orc for a moment that was probably a little too intimate for the scenario, before quickly separating. And then the three ships were in the clear, though Bardov still looked heavily exhausted. Upon which they sailed into the third island, the one on which the temple, the shrine they were supposed to be finding, was placed. The shrine of Oroso, which is what they were supposed to be looking. And after about another hour or so of rowing down the water, while Bardov and Alani tried to recoup their energy, and much to the concerns of the other members of the other two ships, who couldn't really do anything for them other than just keep moving, they came to an area of the forest that was littered with emerald light, beautiful red flowers polka dotted in yellow, and just this surging energy of just calm emotions and vitality. And as they mooned down the water, they heard the sound of something large moving through the river. And they saw this huge dinosaur, this massive long-necked beast with these beautiful magenta red feathers all along its body, which underneath had a second layer of deep moss green. And as they looked on it, the sun sort of poured down through the trees, washing them all in emerald light and hiding the face of the creature. It definitely seemed to notice them, and as they sort of moved past it, it just hit them with this repeated wave of calm. They wanted to panic, they wanted to do something to react, but something was supernaturally suppressing their emotions. They sailed directly under the beast, and on as it walked across the river, eventually they left its sphere of influence, and Mikhail collapsed, crying. And not many members of these boats had an idea what that was, but they knew they had seen something impressive. But Osaha, who was comfortable with history, having worked in his mother's bar for a long time, listening to stories and dancing and performing for people, had heard of legends of 5 powerful dinosaurs that their coming would tell of something very important happening on Ixalan. The coming of the immortal sun again. Like, it spoke of a time of great significant events, and Osaha was sure that they had just seen one of those avatars, one of those dinosaur demigods. And they all sort of sat in stunned silence, letting the current of the river carry them further inland. Um, Except for Mikhail, whose religious connection to the dinosaurs and history with the Empire was far too shook from seeing what he had just saw. And that's where the session closed. Not our most exciting session in terms of combat, but it was definitely rich in story and roleplay, which was very exciting. Our next session will be in 2 weeks. I run, as I mentioned, I might have mentioned this at the start of the video, I run 4 sessions currently, and I do them on alternating weeks. If you have any comments, ideas, or anything you'd like to say in the comments or chat with me about D&D, other role-playing games, DMing, hit me up. Magic the Gathering, whatever. I'm going to end the video here and figure out how I'm going to go render all this together and present it in some way that makes it not look like shit. If I succeeded in that, aces. If I didn't, well, I hope you enjoyed anyways. Have a good one.